Forward it is thus our impression that we can no longer ask the question of the concept, of the history of the concept, and notably of the concept of the archive. No longer, at least, in a temporal or historical modality dominated by the present or by the past. We no longer feel we have the right to ask questions whose form, grammar, and lexicon nonetheless seem so legitimate, sometimes so neutral. We no longer find assured meaning in questions such as these. Do we already have at our disposition a concept of the archive? A concept of the archive which deserves this name? Which is one and whose unity is assured? Have we ever been assured of the homogeneity, of the consistency, of the univocal relationship of any concept to a term or to such a word as archive? In their form and in their grammar, these questions are all turned toward the past. They ask if we already have at our disposal such a concept and if we have ever had any assurance in this regard. To have a concept at one's disposal, to have assurances with regard to it, is to presuppose a closed heritage and the guarantee 133 sealed, in some sense, by that heritage. And the word and the notion of the archive seem at first, admittedly, to point toward the past, to refer to the signs of consigned memory, to recall faithfulness to tradition. If we have attempted to underline the past in these questions from the outset, it is also to indicate the direction of another problematic. As much as and more than a thing of the past, before such a thing, the archive should call into question the coming of the future. And if we still lack a viable, unified, given concept of the archive, it is undoubtedly not a purely conceptual, theoretical, epistemological insufficiency on the level of multiple and specific disciplines. It is perhaps not for lack of sufficient elucidation in certain circumscribed domains: archaeology, documentography, bibliography, philology, historiography. Let us imagine in effect a project of general archiviology, a word that does not exist but that could designate a general and interdisciplinary science of the archive. Such a discipline must in effect risk being paralyzed in a preliminary aporia. It would have either, 1. To include psychoanalysis, a scientific project which, as one could easily show, aspires to be a general science of the archive, of everything that can happen to the economy of memory and to its substrates, traces, documents, in their supposedly psychical or technoprosthetic forms, internal or external, the mystic paths of the past or of the future, what they represent and what they supplement, or, 2. On the contrary, to place itself under the critical authority, in the Kantian sense, of psychoanalysis, continue to dispute it, of course, but after having integrated its logic, its concepts, its metapsychology, its economy, its topic, etc., as Freud repeats them again in such precise fashion in the third part of his Moses, when he treats at length the difficulties, the archival problems of oral narrative and public property, of mystic traces, of archaic and transgenerational heritage, and of everything that can happen to an impression in these at once topic, topish, and genetish, processes. He repeats here that this topic has nothing to do with the anatomy of the brain, and this is enough to complicate the phylogenetic dimension, which he judges to be in effect irreducible but which he is far from simplifying in its Lamarckian schemas. He is often accused of this, by Yerushalmi also, or even its Darwinian ones. The adherents to a biological doctrine of acquired characters of the biological archive, in some cannot be made to agree in a simple and immediate way with all Freud acknowledges otherwise, the memory of the experience of previous generations, the time of the formation of languages and of a symbolicity that transcends given languages and discursivity as such. Freud is careful. He knows and recognizes explicitly the present attitude of biological science, which refuses to hear of the inheritance of acquired characters by succeeding generations Moses and monotheism, SE 23, 100.5 and if he admits that it is difficult for him to do without a reference to biological evolution, and who could seriously reproach him for that, in principle and absolutely, in the name of what, he shows himself in this regard to be more reserved and more circumspect than is usually acknowledged, distinguishing notably between acquired characters, which are hard to grasp, and memory traces of external events SE 23, 100. These characters and these traces could well follow, Freud would certainly not say it here in this form, quite complicated linguistic, cultural, cipherable, and in general ciphered transgenerational and transindividual relays, transiting thus through an archive, the science of which is not at a standstill. This does not necessarily bring us back to Lamarck or to Darwin, even if it obliges us to articulate the history of genetic programs and ciphers on all the symbolic and individual archives differently. All that Freud says is that we are receptive to an analogy between the two types of transgenerational memory or archive, the memory of an ancestral experience or the so-called biologically acquired character, and that we cannot imagine Borstelin one without the other SE 23, 100. Without the irrepressible, that is to say, only suppressible and repressible, force and authority of this transgenerational memory, the problems of which we speak would be dissolved and resolved in advance. There would no longer be any essential history of culture, there would no longer be any question of memory and of archive, of 5. Yerushalmi takes these texts into account. He is well aware that Freud was well aware of it, the inheritance of acquired characters was contested by science. To explain a nonetheless obstinate predilection for Lamarckism, he evokes the precious works of Lisa Grudbrich Simides on this subject, then asks himself if Lamarckism, without of course being something Jewish, did not 135 tempt the Jew in Freud. Deconstructed into Jewish terms, does Lamarckism not signify that the Jew cannot cease being Jewish because one's fate in being Jewish was determined long ago by the fathers, and that often what one feels most deeply and obscurely is a trilling wire in the blood 3L? A letter from Freud whose wife speaks the same language, in effect, concerning the land of Israel and the heritage that centuries of inhabitation have perhaps left in our blood and nerves QTD in Yerushalmi 31. Yerushalmi also cites Adelheid in a note, for Freud, in effect, although human evolution is Darwinian via the genes it is Lamarckian via language and culture 31 and 44. Patriarchive or a matriarchive, and one would no longer even understand how an ancestor can speak within us, nor what sense there might be in us to speak to him or her, to speak in such an unheimlich, uncanny fashion, to his or her ghost. With it, we have already encountered this alternative, we will return to it again. Must one apply to what will have been predefined as the Freudian or psychoanalytic archive in general schemas of reading, of interpretation, of classification which have been received and reflected out of this corpus whose unity is thus presupposed? Or rather, has one on the contrary the right to treat the said psychoanalytico-Freudian archive according to a logic or a method, a historiography or a hermeneutic independent of Freudian psychoanalysis, indeed anterior even to the very name of Freud, while presupposing in another manner the closure and the identity of this corpus? This independence can take numerous forms, pre or post-psychoanalytic, with or without an explicit project, to integrate and to formalize what a minute ago we called the Freudian impression. This is an experience familiar to a number of those who are participating in this conference or who share this concern, and not only, here and there, to the most eminent historians of psychoanalysis. in an enigmatic sense, which will clarify itself perhaps, because nothing should be sure here, for essential reasons. The question of the archive is not, we repeat, a question of the past. It is not the question of a concept dealing with the past that might already be at our disposal or not at our disposal, an archivable concept of the archive. It is a question of the future, the question of the future itself, the question of a response, of a promise and of a responsibility for tomorrow. The archive, if we want to know what that will have meant, we will only know in times to come. Perhaps. Not tomorrow but in times to come, later on or perhaps never. A spectral messianicity is at work in the concept of the archive and ties it, like religion, like history, like science itself, to a very singular experience of the promise. And we are never far from Freud in saying this. Messianicity does not mean messianism. Having explained myself on this elsewhere, inspectors of Marx, and even if this distinction remains fragile and enigmatic, allow me to treat it as established, in order to save time. Later, we ought, perhaps, to formulate the concept and the formal law of this messianic hypothesis. For the moment, allow me to illustrate it while evoking again one of the most striking moments in the scene, if I may say it in front of him, that Yerushalmi has with Freud, at the end of his book, in what he calls his monologue with Freud. We must come to the moment at which Yerushalmi seems to suspend everything, in particular everything he has said and done up to this point, from the thread of a discrete sentence. One could be tempted to regard this thread as the umbilical cord of the book. Everything seems to be suspended from this umbilical cord by the umbilical cord of the event which such a book as this represents. For in a work entirely devoted to memory and to the archive, a sentence on the last page says the future. It says, in the future tense, much will depend, of course, on how the very terms Jewish and science are to be defined. 100. This sentence followed an allusion to much future work, and it aggravated the opening of this future, enlarging it accordingly, in which the very possibility of knowledge remains suspended in the conditional. Professor Freud, at this point I find it futile to ask whether, genetically or structurally, psychoanalysis is really a Jewish science, that we shall know, if it is at all knowable, only when much future work has been done. Much will depend, of course, on how the very terms Jewish and science are to be defined. 100. My emphasis dramatic turn, stroke of theater, coup de theater within coup de theater. In an instant which dislocates the linear order of presence, a second coup de theater illuminates the first. It is also the thunderbolt of love at first sight, a coup de foudre, love and transference, which, in a flash, transfixes with light the memory of the first. 137 with another light. One no longer knows what the time, what the tense of this theater will have been, the first stroke of theater, the first stroke, the first period. The question of the archive remains the same, what comes first? Even better, who comes first? And second? At the end of the preceding chapter, the first coup de theater involving a crucial episode and a canonical text, Yerushalmi had established the extraordinary archive we inscribed in the exergue. He had given his readers the unique copy given, but first of all returned, by the archpatriarch to the patriarch, by Jacob to Sigmund, and yet, right on the substrate of its new skin, the figurative reminder of a circumcision, the impression left on his body by the archive of a disymmetrical covenant without contract, of a head economic covenant to which Sigmund Shalama subscribed before even knowing how to sign much less countersign his name. In the bottomless thickness of this inscription and abim, in the instant of the archaeonomological event, under the new skin of a book that consigns the new skin, wounded and blessed, of a newborn, there resonated already the words intended for the newborn of a God speaking to him in him, within you, even before he could speak, giving him to understand, to hear, in truth to read or to decipher. Go, read my book that I have written. Giving us this archive to read, offering it to us in the course of a masterly decipherment, Yerushalmi, in turn, means less to give than to give back. He acts a bit like Jacob, who does not give Sigmund his Bible but rather gives it back to him. Returns it to him. In giving us this document to read, this true scholar wants also to give back to Freud his own competence, his own capacity to receive and thus to read the Hebrew inscription. He wants above all to make him confess it. Because Freud, and this is the declared aim of Yerushalmi's demonstration, must have known, from a young age, how to read the dedication. He ought, in consequence, to have confessed belonging, thus making his Hebrew culture public, or doing so more clearly than he did. Yerushalmi recalled all Freud's denials on this subject, concerning his own family or himself, all emancipated Aufklärer, he claimed, all Voltairians, and who retained little of Jewish culture. Like Freud's father, the scholar seeks to call Sigmund Shalama back to the covenant by establishing, that is to say, by restoring, the covenant. The scholar repeats, in a way, the gesture of the father. He recalls or he repeats the circumcision, even if the one and the other can only do it, of course, by figure. After the first, a second coup de theater, it is the moment when Professor Yerushalmi, with the incontestable authority of the scholar but in an apparently more filial position, addresses, or rather pretends to address Professor Freud, in truth Freud's ghost, directly. That the position then is more filial, that it manifests the love and the respect of a son, in no way contradicts the repetition of the paternal gesture. Quite possibly it confirms and relaunches it en abim. A scholar addressing a phantom recalls irresistibly the opening of Hamlet. At the spectral apparition of the dead father, Marcellus implores Horatio, thou art a scholar, speak to it, Horatio. I have tried to show elsewhere that though the classical scholar did not believe in phantoms and truly would not know how to speak to them, even forbidding himself to do so, it is quite possible that Marcellus had anticipated the coming of a scholar of the future, a scholar who, in the future and so as to conceive of the future, would dare to speak to the phantom. A scholar who would dare to admit that he knows how to speak to the phantom, even claiming that this not only neither contradicts nor limits his scholarship but will in truth have conditioned it, at the price of some still inconceivable complication that may yet prove the other one, that is, the phantom, to be correct. And perhaps always the paternal phantom, that is, who is in a position to be correct, to be proven correct and to have the last word. Dear and most highly esteemed Professor Freud, so begins this letter. An intensely filial and respectful letter, indeed, but all the more bitter, cutting, merciless in the reproach, one would say murderous in the quibbling, if the other were not dead, and thus infinitely inaccessible in his all-powerful vulnerability. These 30-odd pages are not only to be classed as fiction, which would already be a break with the language that has dominated up to this point in the book, that is, the discourse of scholarship, the discourse of a historian, of a philologist, of an expert on the history of Judaism, of a biblical scholar, as they say, claiming to speak in all objectivity while basing himself on ancient or new archives, and the wealth of these novelties has to do in particular 139 with the fact That certain of these documents, until now hardly visible or inaccessible, secret or private, have been newly interpreted, newly translated, newly illuminated from historical or philological viewpoints. No, this fiction has another originality, which sets the fictionality of the monologue as if en abîme, the apostrophe is addressed to a dead person, to the historian's object becomes spectral subject, the virtual addressee or interlocutor of a sort of open letter. Another archive effect. In its very fiction, this apostrophe enriches the corpus it claims to treat but which it enlarges and of which, in fact, it is henceforth a part. At the end of a tight discussion with the phantom, according to the intersected rules of psychoanalysis and of the Talmud, in the spirit of Eli Didac H, the signatory of the book and of the letter ends by interrogating the specter of Freud. We will come to this. For the moment, we say the book and the letter because if the letter is apparently a part of the book, if the monologue with Freud resembles a last chapter of the book, one can also know two other structural singularities about its relationship to the book which, at least according to the editorial convention of its bibliographic archivization, contains it within itself. In the first place, this fictitious monologue is heterogeneous to the book, in its status, in its project, in its form. It is thus by pure juridical fiction that such a fiction is, in effect, bound in the same book signed by the same author, and that it is classified under 8 scientific rubrics, non-fictional, neither poetic nor novelistic nor literary, in the bibliographic catalogue whose classical categories are all found at the beginning of the work. In the second place, this postscript of sorts retrospectively determines what precedes it. It does it in a decisive fashion, marking it indeed with an essential indecision, namely the umbilical opening of the future, which makes the words Jew and science indeterminate at the very least or in any case accedes to their intermination. Thus one can just as well say that the entire book is in advance contained, as if carried away, drawn in, engulfed by the abysmal element of the monologue, for which it constitutes a kind of long preface, an exurge, a preamble, or a foreword. The true title of the book, its most appropriate title, its truth, would indeed be Monologue with Freud. Let us note this at least on account of the archive, to recall that there could be no archiving without titles, hence without names and without the archontic principle of legitimization, without laws, without criteria of classification and of hierarchization, without order, and without order, in the double sense of the word. In the course of this tete-a-tete discussion, but in the presence of the reader that we are, or God knows who, as terstis, third party, or witness, Freud is no longer treated as a third person represented by his written works, public and private writings, clinical, theoretical, or autobiographical, institutional or not, psychoanalytic and political, scientific, or novelistic because Yerushalmi's entire book turns around a book by Freud that he himself wanted to present as a fiction. Der Mann Moses, ein historischer Roman, while aiming at a new concept of truth, that is, under the name of historical truth, a truth that scholarship, historiography, and perhaps philosophy have some difficulty thinking through. Freud is thus no longer treated as a witness in the third person, terstis, he finds himself called to witness as a second person. A gesture incompatible in principle with the norms of classical scientific discourse, in particular with those of history or of philology, which had presided over the same book up to this point. In addition, the signatory of this monological letter all of a sudden proposes to this second person, who is at first addressed as you and not he, to speak in terms of we. And as he recognizes that this other does not have a true right of reply, he responds for him, in what is at issue here, indeed has been so all along, we both have, as Jews, an equal stake. Therefore in speaking of the Jews I shall not say they. I shall say we. The distinction is familiar to you 81. By definition, because he is dead and thus incapable of responding, Freud can only acquiesce. He cannot refuse this community at once proposed and imposed. He can only say yes to this covenant into which he must enter one more time. Because he will have had to enter it, already, 7 or 8 days after his birth. Mutatis mutandis, this is the situation of absolute dissymmetry and heteronomy in which a son finds himself on being circumcised after the 7th day and on being made to enter into a covenant at a moment when it is out of the question that he respond, sign, or countersign. Here again, the archive marked once in his body, Freud hears himself recalled to the indestructible covenant that this extraordinary per 141 formative engages / shall say we when it is addressed to a phantom or a newborn. Let us note at least in parenthesis, the violence of this communal dissymmetry remains at once extraordinary and, precisely, most common. It is the origin of the common, happening each time we address someone, each time we call them while supposing, that is to say while imposing a we, and thus while inscribing the other person into the situation of an at once spectral and patriarchic nursling. Everything happens here as if Yerushalmi had decided in turn to circumcise Freud, as if he felt an obligation yet to come, I shall say we, to recircumcise him by figure while confirming the covenant, as if he felt the duty, in truth, to repeat Jacob Freud's gesture when, in an inscription at once outside and inside the book, right on the book, in Melitza, he reminded Shalama, in the 7th in the days of the years of your life the Spirit of the Lord began to move you and spoke within you, go, read in my book that I have written. 71. The memory without memory of a mark returns everywhere, about which we ought to debate with Freud, concerning his many rapid statements on this subject. It is clearly the question of the singular archive named circumcision. Although he speaks of it here and there from Freud's or from Jones's point of view, Yerushalmi does not place this mark, at least in its literalness, at the center of his book 6 and the enigma of circumcision, notably in the great war between Judaism and Christianity, is quite often that of its literalness and of all that depends on this. Although I believe this question to be irreducible, in particular in the rereading of Freud, irreducible notably to that of castration, I must put it aside here, not without some regret, along with that of the phylacteries, those archives of skin or parchment covered with writing that Jewish men, here too, and not Jewish women, carry close to their body, on their arm and on their forehead, right on the body to meme i.e. core, like the sign of circumcision, but with a being right. On edre mean that this time does not exclude the detachment and the untying of the ligament, of the substrate, and of the text simultaneously. In this deliberately filial scene that Yerushalmi has with the patriarch of psychoanalysis, the apostrophe is launched from the post 6. The theme of circumcision is, however, taken up from several points of view in Moses. From a historical point of view, it is a conducting fossil, life fossil, for investigating memory and interpreting the Israelites' relations with the servitude in and the exodus from Egypt, where circumcision was an indigenous practice. From a more structural point of view, circumcision is the symbolic substitute of the castration of the son by the primitive father. Scission of the father of the dead father. The other speaks. It is often thus in scenes the son has with the father. Speech comes back to the grandfather. Speech returns, in French la parole revient, as act of speaking and as right to speech. Why is this monologue clearly not a monologue or a soliloquy? Because it plays on the irony of presenting itself as a monologue with. Because more than one person speaks? Undoubtedly, but there is more than the number. There is the order. For if the signatory of the monologue is not alone in signing, far from it, he is above all the first to do so. He speaks from the position of the other, he carries in himself, this mouthpiece, he bears the voice that could be that of Jacob Freud, namely the archpatriarch of psychoanalysis. And thus, in the name of Jacob, the voice of all the archpatriarchs in history, in Jewish history in particular, for example those who not only inscribe their sons in the covenant at the moment of circumcision, and do it more than once, literally, or by figure, but do not cease to be surprised and to remain skeptical about the possibility that a daughter could speak in her own name. I have just alluded to the last request that the signatory of this monologue without response addresses to Freud's phantom. This request is carried in a question. We must distinguish between the one and the other here. The request questions on the subject of Anna Freud. Your Antigone, says Yerushalmi in passing, Yerushalmi, who, clearly thus identifying Freud, his spectre, with Oedipus, thinks perhaps that this will suffice to Oedipalize his own relationship with Freud, as if there were no possibility of ever becoming Oedipus's Oedipus. In 1977, Anna Freud was invited by the Hebrew University of Jerusalem to inaugurate an endowed chair carrying the name of her long-dead father. Unable to go she sends, a written statement. In this other archive document, which Yerushalmi invests with Pi 43 Zion, Anna declares, among other things, that the accusation according to which psychoanalysis is a Jewish science, under present circumstances, can serve as a title of honor 100. Yerushalmi asks himself whether the sentence written by Anna is indeed signed by Anna. Asking himself this, he asks his spectral interlocutor, he asks himself, of his spectre who would first have asked himself this, if his daughter spoke in her own name, as if he doubted that a daughter, above all the daughter of Freud, could speak in her own name, almost 30 years after the father's death, and above all as if he wished, still secretly, a secret which he says he wants to keep, that is to say, to share with Freud, to be alone in sharing with Freud, that she had always spoken in the name of her father, in the name of the father. In fact, I will limit myself even further and be content if you answer only one question. When your daughter conveyed those words to the Congress in Jerusalem, was she speaking in your name? Please tell me, Professor. I promise I won't reveal your answer to anyone. 100. These are the last words of the book. Everything seems to be sealed by this ultimate signature in the form of a promise. Secretly but visibly, sheltered by a secret he wants manifest, by a secret he is anxious to make public, Yerushalmi wishes that Anna Antigone had only been the living spokesperson, the faithful interpreter, the voice-bearer come to support her dead father and to represent his word, his name, his belonging, his thesis, and even his faith. What, according to Yerushalmi, did she say, then? That in spite of all Freud's strategic denials, denegations, in spite of all the political precautions he expressed throughout his life concerning the universal, non-Jewish, essence of psychoanalysis, it ought to honor itself for being Jewish, for being a fundamentally, essentially, radically Jewish science, Jewish in a different sense from the anti-Semitic allegation, while revealing the historical truth of anti-Semitism. It seems to me that Yerushalmi's thesis advances here while withdrawing itself. But it is a thesis with a rather particular status and a paradoxical movement. It posits not so much what is as what will have been and ought to or should be in the future, namely that psychoanalysis should in the future have been a Jewish science. I will return in a moment to this temporal modality, in a sense, admittedly, which is radically different from that of the anti-Semitic denunciation, but which would bring to light, one more time, and according to a very Freudian gesture in its style and tradition, the truth that could be carried by the anti-Semitic unconscious. We will return to this question in another form momentarily. For the time being, I will pull from this web a single interpretative thread, the one that concerns the archive. What happens to the status of the archive in this situation? Well, the day when in an absolutely exceptional, unprecedented, unique, and inaugural fashion, indeed one that is incompatible with the tradition and the very idea of science, of episteme, of historia, or of theoria, indeed of philosophy in the West, the day, and from the moment when a science presenting itself as such and under this name binds itself intrinsically not only to the history of a proper name, of affiliation, and of a house, here Freud's house, but to the name and to the law of a nation, of a people, or of a religion, here psychoanalysis as Jewish science, this would have the consequence, among others, of radically transforming the relationship of such a science to its own archive. And in the same stroke, having kept an essential account of the singularity of an archaean, this would transform the concept of science and the concept of the archive. In the classical structure of their concept, a science, a philosophy, a theory, a theorem are or should be intrinsically independent of the singular archive of their history. We know well that these things, science, philosophy, theory, etc., have a history, a rich and complex history that carries them and produces them in 1,000 ways. We know well that in diverse and complicated ways, proper names and signatures count. But the structure of the theoretical, philosophical, scientific statement, and even when it concerns history, does not have, should not in principle have, an intrinsic and essential need for the archive, and for what binds the archive in all its forms to some proper name or to some body proper, to some, familial or national, filiation, to covenants, to secrets. It has no such need, in any case, in its relationship or in its claim to truth in the classical sense of the term. But as soon as one speaks of a Jewish science, whatever one's 145 understanding of this word, and I will come back to this in an instant, the archive becomes a founding moment for science as such, not only the history and the memory of singular events, of exemplary proper names, languages, and filiations, but the deposition in an archaean, which can be an ark or a temple, the consignation in a place of relative exteriority, whether it has to do with writings, documents, or ritualized marks on the body proper, for example, phylacteries, or circumcision. At issue here is nothing less than taking seriously the question whether a science can depend on something like a circumcision. We are deliberately saying something like a circumcision to designate the place of this problem, a place that is itself problematic, between the figure and literalness. Can one be satisfied with Freud's many statements on circumcision, always quickly tied to castration or to the threat of castration? To explain the genesis of anti-Semitism, namely, the jealousy with regard to a people which presented itself, he says, as the favored eldest son of God, Freud evokes in his Moses the circumscribed isolation of the Jews, the isolation that cuts them off from the world, the solitude of their exclusion by a circumcision which, according to him, always recalls dreaded castration. This seems less interesting, in any case here, or less convincing, than the manner in which Freud characterizes the impression which circumcision leaves on those who are uncircumcised, a disagreeable, uncanny unheimlich impression 7 SE 2391. I have attempted elsewhere to show, and cannot go into it here, that each time the word unheimlich appears in Freud's text and not only in the essay of this title, Das Unheimlich, one can localize an uncontrollable undecidability in the axiomatics, the epistemology, the logic, the order of the discourse and of the thetic or theoretic statements, and the same is true, in just as significant a way, of Heidegger. Yerushalmi undoubtedly thinks, and his book seems in any case to aim at demonstrating, that psychoanalysis is a Jewish science. It seems to aim for it in an original sense. Proposing a rigorous and scientific renewal of reading, he bases himself on an archive sometimes archaic, the oldest biblical or Talmudic tradition, sometimes recently published. In any case he leaves his own demonstration suspended at the point where it might seem to be conclusive. The fundamental question remains without response. Without response on Freud's part. Yerushalmi clearly wants this to come from Freud's mouth. Freud must also say, in his own name, that he avows and proclaims, in an irreducible performative, that psychoanalysis should honor itself for being a Jewish science. A performative by 7. Ferner hat unter den Sitten, durch die sich die Juden absonderten, die der Beschneidung ihnen unliefsamen, unheimlichen Eindruck gemacht. Which he would as much determine science, psychoanalytic science, as the essence of Jewishness, if not Judaism. It goes without saying, if one could put it this way, that Freud's phantom does not respond. That is at least how things appear. But can this be trusted? In promising secrecy for a virtual response which keeps us waiting, which will always keep us waiting, the signatory of this monologue lets it be understood that Freud would never say in public, for example in a book and in what is destined to become public archive, what he thinks in truth secretly, like the monologuist who says we, namely, that, yes, psychoanalysis is indeed a Jewish science. Is this not incidentally what he has already, in private, so often suggested? Is this not what he has already murmured in remarks, entrusted to letters, consigned in 1,000 signs that Yerushalmi has inventoried, classed, put in order, interpreted with unprecedented vigilance and jubilation? But at the end of the book, the monologuist who says he is ready to respect the secret, to keep for his personal archives the response that the phantom, with its own mouth, could murmur in his ear in private. Nothing seems to me more serious than what is in play in this conclusion, in the very secret of its opening, in the fiction of its suspense. For a large number of reasons. Some of them seem to be turned toward the past, others toward the future of the archive. Concerning the former, those which look toward the past, I will say only a word. It will go in the direction of what, in Freud's eyes, and in particular in the Rat Man, ties the progress of science and of reason to the advent of the patriarchate. In a note which I do not have the time to read here and will comment on elsewhere, Freud makes 3 mistakes, with Lichtenberg, whose support he seeks. He makes a mistake in affirming that there can be no doubt I-47 about the identity of the mother, insofar as it depends on the witness of the senses, while the identity of the father always remains doubtful since it depends, and it alone, on a rational inference, as that legal fiction of which Stephen speaks in Joyce's Ulysses. However, better than ever today, if only with the possibility of surrogate mothers, prosthetic maternities, sperm banks, and all the artificial inseminations, as they are secured for us already and will be secured still more for us in the future by biogenetic technoscience, we know that maternity is as inferred, constructed, and interpreted as paternity. And as paternal law. In truth, it has always been thus, for the one and for the other. Freud makes a second mistake in believing with Lichtenberg that paternity, and it alone, is as uncertain as the question of whether the moon is inhabited. We know today, in all objective certainty, that the moon is uninhabited, and, conversely, it is easier to see and to touch that satellite soil than the certain identity of a mother. He makes a third mistake in drawing from all these errors, illusions, or phantasms a phallogocentric conclusion, because of this presumed call to reason in the assignation of paternity, beyond the witness of the senses. The passage to patriarchy marked the civilizing triumph of reason over sensibility, of science over perception. In doubting that Anna Antigone had spoken, from London to Jerusalem, in her own name, invisibly hoping that she had spoken in the name of the father of her dead father, what does the signatory of the monologue with Freud aim to overprint in the we of this unilateral contract and of this covenant, in this recircumcision of Freud? Well, he perhaps inscribes, perhaps, I am indeed saying perhaps, as if he were signing his name, a discreet but energetic and ineffaceable virility, we the fathers, we the archons, we the patriarchs, guardians of the archive and of the law. I say perhaps, because all these questions remain as suspended as the future to which I now turn. I am indeed saying perhaps, as Yerushalmi says perhaps at one of the most decisive moments of his suspended conclusions, absurd? Possibly. But omerdic perhaps, after all. 99. What is at issue here is coming to a conclusion on the subject of Freud's secret, of his dissimulated or unavowable thought according to which psychoanalysis would be a Judaism without God, or according to which, concerning the future of Lewis and of Oedipus or the future of religion, there would be no hope. Why, oh you may very well be right, says Yerushalmi, who sees in the closure of the future, in hopelessness, in the non-promise, more than in the atheism, what is least Jewish, most un-Jewish, in Freud, such that Jewishness here, if not Judaism, comes down, in its minimal essence, but as science itself, to the openness of the future. But it is on this question of hope or hopelessness, Yerushalmi will say to Freud, even more than on God or godlessness, that your teaching may be at its most un-Jewish. 95.8 I stress this essential modality of the perhaps, as I am always tempted to do. It seems to me to be irreducible. Nietzsche claimed to recognize the thinkers of the future by their courage to say perhaps. I emphasize perhaps for yet another reason, while alluding to that patriarchal filiation of elders into which Yerushalmi seems to inscribe himself, at least by one of his gestures. Because he also asks Professor Freud a remarkable question about the identity of the mother, in his Oedipal schema, perhaps a nonsensible identity, shielded perhaps from the witness of the senses, like the legal fiction of the father, and even more than this because this time the woman would be the law itself, the Torah, the teaching, the revelation, the Torah which in Hebrew is grammatically feminine and which is midrashically compared to a bride. It is over possession of her that Christianity, the younger son, came to challenge, not so much the father as Judaism, the elder son. For this struggle sibling rivalry is perhaps too tame a phrase. Psychologically, and alas, all too often even historically, we are talking about fratricide. 92.9b. Yes, let us rather speak of the future. Just before asking his question of the phantom of the patriarch, of the archontic specter of psychoanalysis, at the moment he promises to keep the secret, above all if he confirms that psychoanalysis is indeed a Jewish science, Yerushalmi takes the risk of making a decisive gesture. In it, Yerushalmi indeed distinguishes, and we will come back to this later, between Jewishness and Judaism. Judaism can be terminable and finite, as religion, tradition, or culture. Jewishness is not. One cannot translate at its most un-Jewish by the furthest away from Judaism ia plus éloigné de Judaism, as the French translation does, without the risk of betraying or missing the very thesis of this book. 9. On this question of the brother between Judaism and Christianity, and in particular in the institution of psychoanalysis, permit me to refer you to Politiques de l'Amitié, notably 310 ff, devoting some fine pages to this question of fratricide. Yerushalmi puts forth the hypothesis according to which the figure of Cain offers an explanation which is as potent as that of Oedipus. In a single paragraph, he overturns the entire epistemological axiomatic which had seemed up to this point to be a presupposition of his discourse. To describe this gesture I will select, once again, only what concerns the archive. First of all, it seems that in private, and I stress this point, in a private letter, Freud had already given, in the essentials, the very response that Yerushalmi seems to be waiting for or pretends to be waiting for, by promising to keep it to himself, as if he wanted to have for himself in secret, here, for his very own self, Joseph Hayem Yerushalmi, the principle of an equally private response which Freud had already given, 65 years earlier, to Enrico Morselli. As if he wanted to share with Freud, all alone, a secret that Freud had already confided to someone else, before Yerushalmi was even born. In 1926, Yerushalmi writes, "You wrote privately to Enrico Morselli that you were not sure that his notion that psychoanalysis is a direct product of the Jewish mind is correct, but that if it is, you wouldn't be ashamed 100. After having cited this private document, Yerushalmi adds a remark. It displaces in one stroke the whole question of the equation between Judaism and psychoanalysis. The two terms of such an equation become equally unknown, indeterminate, yet to be determined, totally given over to the future. Let us read this declaration, on the last page of the monologue. Professor Freud, at this point I find it futile to ask whether, genetically or structurally, psychoanalysis is really a Jewish science, that we shall know, if it is at all knowable, only when much future work has been done. Much will depend, of course, on how the very terms Jewish and science are to be defined. Right now, leaving the semantic and epistemological questions aside, I want only to know whether you ultimately came to believe it to be so. 100. Yerushalmi emphasizes what is important is not so much the content of what Freud would say. Freud, moreover, has already acknowledged it in a way as the fact that he should say it, him, you, with his mouth, and sign it henceforth with his name, and sign it as one subscribes to a belief, whether you ultimately came to believe it to be so. This is only what he wants to know. I want only to know whether you ultimately came to believe it to be so. Time and age count. Yerushalmi knows, and he was the first to recall it, that Freud believed this, at least 65 years earlier. If he asks it of him again, if he asks for more, if he seems to ask a new confirmation of him, it is as if he wanted the last word, the last will, the ultimate signature, ultimately, of a dying father, and to be even more sure, of an already dead father. He wants an ultimate repetition. At the last minute, he asks for an ineffaceable counter-signature, of what Freud said 65 years earlier and on quite a few other occasions. This last engagement ought to be irreversible, by definition. Engaging a dead person, it would no longer be subject to the strategic calculations, to the denials of the living Freud, and to the retractions of the founder of a psychoanalysis exposed to all the anti-Semitic violences. This declaration seems to change all the signs. It is this alone, it seems to me, that can carry and justify the book's subtitle, Judaism Terminable and Interminable. It leaves open to the future, not only the definition, hence the determinability as much as the terminability, of Judaism, but also those of psychoanalysis. Up to this point, in any case up to the opening of this fictive monologue, Yerushalmi had measured his discourse for the bulk of what, in theory, was shown and demonstrated on the classical norms of knowledge, of scholarship, and of epistemology which dominate in every scientific community. Here, the objectivity of the historian, of the archivist, of the sociologist, of the philologist, the reference to stable themes and concepts, the relative exteriority in relation to the object, particularly in relation to an archive determined as already given, in the past or in any case only incomplete, determinable, and thus terminable in a future itself determinable as future present. 151. Domination of the constative over the performative, etc. This is how one can interpret the remark, made in passing, concerning the discovery and the unexpected publication, in 1980, of the private archive of Sabina Spielrein. This discovery, Yerushalmi notes, should also serve to remind us of how incomplete and tentative any conclusions must be in our reconstructions of the history of psychoanalysis, until the mounds of material still unpublished or deliberately restricted are made available. 44. An incompleteness of the archive, and thus a certain determinability of the future, should be taken into consideration by the historian in any reconstructions of the history of psychoanalysis. Now this incompleteness is of an entirely different order from that of the future which is in question at the end of the monologue. In the middle of the book, what was in question was still an incompleteness and a future that belonged to the normal time of scientific progress. Without a doubt, at the end of the monologue Yerushalmi again alludes to the future of some future work. But the future of which he then speaks, and above all when it concerns the concepts of science and of Jewishness, is not of the order of such relative incompleteness. It is no longer only the provisional intermination that opens the ordinary field of a scientific work in progress and always unfinished, in particular because new archives can still be discovered, come out of secrecy or the private sphere, so as to undergo new interpretations. It is no longer a question of the same time, of the same field, and of the same relationship to the archive. At the moment when the historian declares to the patriarch that it would be futile to ask whether, genetically or structurally, psychoanalysis is really a Jewish science, and when he adds, that we shall know, if it is at all knowable, my emphasis, only when much future work has been done. Much will depend, of course, on how the very terms Jewish and science are to be defined. At this moment he changes registers and times entirely. In a stroke, he suspends all the axiomatic assurances, norms, and rules which had served him until now in organizing the scientific work, notably historiographic criticism, and in particular its relationship to the known and unknown archive. The very order of knowledge, at least of classical knowledge, is suspended. At issue is another concept of the future, to which we will return. Since the questions that dominate the whole book, up to this monologue, concern the relations between Judaism and science, notably that science which psychoanalysis has wanted to be, Yerushalmi the scholar presumed continuously the knowledge of what science and Judaism meant. When an evaluation of the scientific character of psychoanalysis was in question, the historian often showed himself to be very severe and without appeal, concerning what he calls, in this book as in Zachtor, Jewish history and Jewish memory, Freud's Lamarckism, or Psycho-Lamarckism 109, 0. It is an antiquity condemned by the state of science, of a science which is not Yerushalmi's science and of which he invokes the results, in sum, from the exterior, as would a historian, who would content himself to record the results that are validated, at a particular moment, by a scientific community in which he does not actively participate and of which he does not share the competencies. On the other hand, Yerushalmi accepts, we can suppose, that he belongs to the scientific community of historians or of sociologists of culture, in particular of Jewish culture. He is professor of Jewish history, culture, and society. He shares actively and brilliantly in its productions, he increases and refines its abilities. But in what has to do with the genetics or the history of life, he accepts the role of neutral observer and in the end of doxographer. He must know that in this domain things are more turbulent and more open to the future than ever, more than anywhere else, and not without some relation to the future status of archivization. The epistemological status that he claims for his discourse would thus merit a thorough study. We shall only set up the cartography of the borders he assigns himself. This is not so easy, given the mobility of such limits. It seems that in the quasi-totality of the work, and up to the threshold of the monologue, the author presents himself as a historian who claims to hold himself deliberately exterior to his object. The historian, the subject of this historical knowledge, does not then present himself either as a Jew or as a psychoanalyst, as such. He treats the psychoanalytic archive as data, the right of access to which, the intelligibility, the evaluation of which are not properly the affair either of the Jew or of the psychoanalyst. I-53 On many occasions, Yerushalmi claims this distance as the very condition for the history he intends to write. He does it, for example, by putting these words of Philippe Aries in the excerpt of his last chapter, just before the monologue words that for 10. In a postscript of 1987 which does not appear in the first edition. My part, and as is often the case for what Aries says and does in general, I find more than problematic. One can make an attempt at the history of behavior, that is to say, at a psychological history, without being oneself either a psychologist or a psychoanalyst and while keeping oneself at a distance from the theories, the vocabulary, and even the methods of modern psychology, and nevertheless to engage these very psychologists on their terrain. If one is born a historian one becomes a psychologist in one's own fashion. 57 To express briefly my perplexity on this point, and why I do not share Yerushalmi's confidence when he cites such a remark, finding in it some backing no doubt, I wonder what it could mean to be born a historian, si on nate historan. And to base one's authority on this from an epistemological point of view. And above all, conscio non dato, supposing that, in such conditions, one could do a psychological history, this would not suffice to do a history of psychology, even less of psychoanalysis, and above all not at this point where the science, this project for a science at least, which is called psychoanalysis, claims to transform the very status of the historian's object, the structure of the archive, the concept of historical truth, indeed of science in general, the methods of deciphering the archive, the implication of the subject in the space he claims to objectivize, and notably the topology of all the internal/external partitions that structure the subject and make of him a place for archives in relation to which no objectivization is pure, nor in truth rigorously possible, which is to say, complete and terminable. Even a classical historian of science should know from the inside the content of the sciences of which he does the history. And if this content concerns in fact historiography, there is no good method or good epistemology for authorizing oneself to put it into parenthesis. One deprives oneself in this case of the elementary conditions, of the minimal semantic stability, and almost of the grammar which would allow one to speak about that of which one speaks. To want to speak about psychoanalysis, to claim to do the history of psychoanalysis from a purely psychoanalytic point of view, purified of all psychoanalysis, to the point of believing one could erase the traces of any Freudian impression, is like claiming the right to speak without knowing what one's speaking about, without even wanting to hear anything about it. This structure is not only valid for the history of psychoanalysis, or for any discourse on psychoanalysis, it is valid at least for all the so-called social or human sciences, but it receives a singular inflection here which we must examine a bit more closely. In fact, Yerushalmi knows that he cannot have this exteriority. He knows it too well. To liberate his discourse of all Freudian pre-impression is not only impossible, it would be illegitimate. But as he also doesn't want to renounce this alleged constitutive and theoretical neutrality which the classical scholar or historian claims as his norm, the position of his discourse here, in any case in the better part of his book and before the monologue, is double, equivocal, unstable, I would even say exquisitely tormented. Doomed to denial, sometimes avowed in its very denial. At once persecuted and translated by the symptoms that call irresistibly for a postscript, namely, this monologue with Freud, which resembles or pretends to resemble the beginning of an analysis and the declared confession of a transfer. Whether it resembles or pretends to resemble, this postscript undoubtedly carries, in truth, in its very fiction, the truth of the hook. This is marked in particular in the trembling of a gesture and the instability of a status. The historian refuses to be a psychoanalyst but also refrains from not being a psychoanalyst. We shall take only two examples, precisely where they affect a double relationship to the archive. The first, the arch example, shows us the desire of an admirable historian who wants in sum to be the first archivist, the first to discover the archive, the archaeologist, and perhaps the archon of the archive. The first archivist institutes the archive as it should be, 155 that is to say, not only in exhibiting the document but in establishing it. He reads it, interprets it, classes it. In this case, what is in play is all the more serious, as the document turns out to keep this inscription in the form of a dedication that accompanies a reiterated gift, the second present, the restitution of the Philipsone Bible by the Archpatriarch to the Patriarch of Psychoanalysis, the present which Jacob son of Arshalom of Fried gives to Shalamus Sigmund Freud, 35 years after a circumcision, which it begins by recalling to him and naming the Ark of the Covenant and the tablets of the law. Yerushalmi announces in sum that he will be the first, after Freud, indeed the only person, after Freud, to open, if not to hold, the archive of what he calls one crucial episode. He would like, as we will see, to be the first here, the first after Freud, the first second, an eldest son, the first second and thus for a moment alone with Freud, alone in sharing a secret. He is certainly not the only one or the first to want to be the first after Freud and thus alone with Freud. We have several others in France, in that French lineage from which Yerushalmi seems to want to shield himself but why, as from the plague. This being the case, for what reason does he still hesitate? Why is he so embarrassed about the question as to whether he proceeds in the manner of those whom he will later call ordinary historians 86, or already in the manner of a psychoanalyst historian, in other words, in some sense, in the manner of an inheritor in the lineage of the patriarchs or archpatriarchs whose archive he deciphers for the first time, and properly. He says properly twice. And he claims to be neither an analyst nor a non-analyst, denying the two hypotheses at once, thus not denying either one, successively or simultaneously. The passage is as follows. There is one crucial episode involving Jacob and Sigmund Freud which has not yet been properly assessed, my emphasis, not least because it involves a Hebrew text which has never been properly transcribed, again my emphasis. The handwriting is admittedly difficult, let alone adequately glossed, 45 my emphasis. But it is, in effect, the one canonical text of Jacob Freud at our disposal. In what follows I neither presume to dignify my reconstruction as psychoanalytic, though it is no less so than others that pretend to be, this will be a magnificent and luminous reading, nor, given the limitations of a single text, do I claim more than a partial insight. 7011-2. I recommend note 45 133-34, to those who may be further interested in Yerushalmi's concern to mark at once the priority and the exclusive pro. Here now is the following example, the example also of that which follows, a second example of primo-secondariness, the example of this eldest son, of this second eldest son of Jacob Freud, of this double status of a historian who refuses without wanting to refuse to be without being a psychoanalyst. Yerushalmi says to us in the conditional tense what he would say, and thus what he says, if he were to permit himself what he thus permits himself, namely, the luxury of a technical psychoanalytic term, an example of deferred obedience. Should I finally allow myself the luxury of a technical psychoanalytic term, an example of deferred obedience. 77. At issue here is the deferred obedience of Freud to his father, of the patriarch to the archpatriarch. One has a hard time halting the sequence and the scene. In a few minutes, we will perhaps speak of Yerushalmi's deferred obedience to each of these figures and draw from this some conclusions. A precious documentary question, once again, of archaeological excavation and of the detection of the archive. It concerns a single sentence in a sort of intellectual autobiography. Point 12 Freud added the sentence, as an expression of remorse, only in 1935, 1 year after the first sketch of Moses. It is important to know that the sentence was omitted, accidentally, the Standard Edition says, in the Gesammeltwerke of 1948, and it is also absent, and for good reason, from the French translation of Marie Bonaparte, which dates from 1928. But this omission was maintained in later editions, at least until 1950. One could add this small philological remark to the file Freud himself investigates in chapter 6 of the second essay of his Moses SE 2341 FF, in the course of those rich pages on archivization, the oral tradition and the written tradition, biblical exegesis, historiography, and all the Endstellungen, all the deformations of a text which he compares to murders. I now cite the sentence added by Freud in 1935, as it is cited by Yerushalmi, 157 Priority of this reading, what is appropriate about it and what remains proper to it. This note concerns the competition of two other transcriptions, translations, and analyses. 12 The text, Selbstdarstellungen, first published in Die Medizin der Gegenwart, 1925, appeared in English as an autobiographical study SE 20, 7-70. My deep engrossment in the Bible story, almost as soon as I had learned the art of reading, had, as I recognized much later, an enduring effect upon the direction of my interest. SE 20, 8, QTD. In Yerushalmi 77 Yerushalmi interprets the document which this edition constitutes, 10 years after the first edition. Significantly, the last sentence did not appear in the first edition. It was added only in 1935, the year after the completion of the manuscript draft of Moses. Only now, in retrospect, did Freud realize the full impact of the study of the Bible on his life, and only now did he fully acknowledge it. In this sense Moses and monotheism represents, at last, a fulfillment of Jacob Freud's mandate, or should I finally allow myself the luxury of a technical psychoanalytic term, an example of deferred obedience. 77 What should we think of this deferred obedience? I will note first in parenthesis that the little sentence on the deep engrossment in the Bible was immediately followed by another, which Yerushalmi does not cite. Judging it to be legitimately beyond the domain of his remarks, he cuts just before it. From the first edition on, this sentence declared the admiring and fascinated hope which Freud had very early for what Darwin's theories he does not name Lamarck here were able to promise at the time for the future of science. In this concept of deferred obedience, one can be tempted to recognize one of the keys or, if you prefer, one of the seals of this archion, I mean of this book by Yerushalmi, at least as an archival book on the archive. In fact, the key or the seal, what signs and offers to be read is less a concept, the Freudian concept of deferred obedience, than its implementation by Yerushalmi. This implementation takes the concept without taking it, uses it without using it, it mentions rather than uses it, as a speech acts theorist would say, it makes a concept, begriff, out of it which in turn grasps without grasping, comprehends without taking. And this double gesture of someone who intends at once to assume and not to assume the theoretico-scientific responsibility of such a concept, this is precisely the scene of luxury which the conditional coquetry describes. Should I finally allow myself the luxury of a technical psychoanalytic term, an example of deferred obedience? The play of this I of jury is at the joint between truth and fiction. It assures the unity of the book, it seems to me, insofar as it articulates together 4 chapters of scholarship which see themselves as conforming to the traditional norms of scientificity, and a last chapter of fictive monologue with the spectre who, at least apparently, no longer responds. But the last chapter, the most fictive, is certainly not the least true. In its own way, even if it does not say the truth, it makes the truth, in the sense in which Augustine could say this of confession. It inspires something else in us about the truth of the truth, about the history of the truth, as about the truth of the enigmatic difference Freud wanted to mark between material truth and historical truth. I cannot imagine a better introduction to the question of the archive, today, than the very stakes of this vertiginous difference. How does the luxury of this deferred obedience join, according to me, the 2 periods of this book? The history of this concept, Nachtriegehorsam, docility after the fact, as Yerushalmi retraces it in a few lines, goes back to totem and taboo. 13 Freud notes there that the dead father became stronger than the living one. In accordance with the psychological procedure so familiar to us in psychoanalyses under the name of deferred obedience SE 13, 143. From this very convincing staging, Yerushalmi draws all the consequences. Coming from totem and taboo, the technical concept of deferred obedience is borrowed and transferred, here too with the required delay, onto Freud himself, Freud the author of I-59 Moses. The deferred docility here becomes that of Sigmund to Jacob, his father. 13. It is a passage that I attempted to interpret previously, in its relationship to the origin of the law and with reference to Kafka's Vardamgesetz. Cf. Prejugs, Devant Laloy. 60. In writing Moses and monotheism he belatedly obeys the Father and fulfills his mandate by returning to the intensive study of the Bible, but at the same time he maintains his independence from his Father through his interpretation. He rejects the material truth of the biblical narrative but rejoices in his discovery of its historical truth. 78. Where does this leave us? Yerushalmi asks before praising Lou Andrea Salome, who says she read a new form of the return of the repressed in Moses, this time not in the form of phantoms out of the past but rather in the form of what one could call a triumph of life. The afterlife survivans no longer means death and the return of the specter, but the surviving of an excess of life which resists annihilation, the survival of the most triumphant vital elements of the past. 78. 2 pages later, at the beginning of the monologue with Freud, Yerushalmi dares to address himself to Freud. Thus he himself speaks to one of these phantoms out of the past. This new scholar seems to have come straight from Hamlet, thou art a Scholar, speak to it, Horatio. He apostrophizes the paternal specter of Professor Freud. This is an uncommon and perhaps unprecedented scene in the history of psychoanalysis. Though I would like to, I cannot do justice either to the veiled richness or to the bottomless irony of this extraordinary monologue, during which a historian has dared to cross a limit before which ordinary historians 86 have always been intimidated. I shall hold myself, once again, to the instance of the archive. And I shall undoubtedly teach nothing to the author of this great monologue with Freud as I venture a few remarks which, obedient in turn, I will group under the title of deferred obedience. Which one? No longer, 1. The obedience after the fact Freud speaks of in Totem and Taboo, no longer, 2. The one Yerushalmi speaks of, that of Sigmund to Jacob, his father, but indeed, 3. The deferred docility of Yerushalmi with respect to Freud. Let us describe this time of repetition with the words Yerushalmi reserves for Freud. 1. Yerushalmi in turn addresses himself at last and belatedly to Freud's phantom with filial respect. 2. He returns in turn to the intensive study of the Bible. 3. He maintains his independence. Mimicking a doubly fictitious parricide, he argues bitterly with a master whose psychoanalytic rules and premises he accepts. He also interiorizes the discourse of the patriarch, at least in respecting the according to you of the Elididaic, Talmudic terminus technicus. All these signs remind us that Yerushalmi also belatedly obeys the Father, whether he wants to or not. He identifies with him while interiorizing him like a phantom who speaks in him before him. He offers him hospitality and goes so far as to confess to him not without fervor, you are real and, for me, curiously present 81. Now let us not forget, this is also the phantom of an expert in phantoms. The expert had even stressed that what is most interesting in repression is what one does not manage to repress. The phantom thus makes the law even, and more than ever, when one contests him. Like the father of Hamlet behind his visor, and by virtue of a visor effect, the spectre sees without being seen. He thus re-establishes the heteronomy. He finds himself confirmed and repeated in the very protest one claims to oppose to him. He dictates even the words of the person who addresses him, for example the strange word engrossment, after having used it to translate Freud's belated confession about his impregnation by biblical culture, Yerushalmi applies it now to himself, deliberately or not, to describe his own investment in this archive of Freud which has become a sort of Bible for him, a spectral Bible. He speaks of his engrossment, by or in Freud's corpus. With a gesture in which it is impossible to discern between love and hate, but also between their simulacral doubles, Yerushalmi painfully, laboriously justifies himself to Freud, one would almost say in asking for his forgiveness. He even recalls, if one must believe him, that, unlike other inheritors and wayward sons, he has not looked for the secrets or I-61 the weaknesses of the master, of the one who remains, like Goethe, through the autobiographical records, a careful concealer. I have not rummaged through your life in search of flaws. Those uncovered by others in recent years have not affected my engrossment in your uncommon achievement, which continues to pursue me like an unlaid ghost. 82 Naturally, by all appearances, we believe we know that the phantom does not respond. He will never again respond, Yerushalmi knows it. On the strength of more than one reason, Freud will never again speak. 1. He will never again respond in the future because he had already responded, and even with what Yerushalmi wants to hear from his lips to Morse Eli for example, more than half a century earlier. 2. He will never again respond because he will have been in a position to have, already, always responded. 3. He will never again respond because it is a phantom, thus a dead person. 4. He will never again respond because it is the phantom, of an analyst, and perhaps because the analyst should withdraw to this spectral position, the place of the dead person, from which, leaving one to speak, he makes one speak, never responding except to silence himself, only being silent to let the patient speak, long enough to transfer, to interpret, to work. So here is what we believe we know at least, here is the appearance, the other will never again respond. Now in spite of these necessities, these obvious facts and these substantiated certitudes, in spite of all the reassuring assurances which such a knowing or such a believing to know dispenses to us, through them, the phantom continues to speak. Perhaps he does not respond, but he speaks. A phantom speaks. What does this mean? In the first place or in a preliminary way, this means that without responding it disposes of a response, a bit like the answering machine whose voice outlives its moment of recording. You call, the other person is dead, now, whether you know it or not, and the voice responds to you, in a very precise fashion, sometimes cheerfully, it instructs you, it can even give you instructions, make declarations to you, address your requests, prayers, promises, injunctions. Supposing, conceso non dato, that a living being ever responds in an absolutely living and infinitely well-adjusted manner, without the least automatism, without ever having an archival technique overflow the singularity of an event, we know in any case that a spectral response, thus informed by a technique and inscribed in an archive, is always possible. There would be neither history nor tradition nor culture without that possibility. It is this that we are speaking of here. It is this, in truth, that we must answer for. We cannot reconstitute here the virtual exchange of questions and answers set in motion in such a monologue on the subject of the very content of Moses. This entire Talmudico-psychoanalytic discussion is fascinating and passionate. But can one not then say that a priori it shows Freud to be right? Can one not claim that the very structure of the scene, the formal logic of the arguments, the topology, and the strategy of the interlocutors, living or spectral, show Freud to be right, even and, perhaps, above all where he is wrong, from the point of view of material truth? Even where the dead person may be put to death again, Freud like so many others, from Lewis to Moses. Even where he is accused of so many shortcomings by the one who proceeds while repeating I repeat, I do not blame you 98. To do justice. Yet again, I would like to but cannot do justice to the intense and rich discussion staged by this final monologue. If I should fail to do it, which seems to me unfortunately inevitable, it is not due only to some limit or another, personal, factual, alas real, it is not due even to the lack of time. This fatal injustice is due to the necessity of showing, a priori, the person occupying the position of Freud here to be right. This is the strange violence I would like to speak of, also out of concern for justice, because I shall no doubt be unjust out of concern for justice, while making myself in turn guilty of it a priori. Simultaneously fictive and effective, taut, dramatic, as generous as it is implacable, this monologue does not deprive the other of his right to speak. Not without injustice can one say that Freud has no chance to speak. He is the first to speak, in a certain sense, and the last word is offered to him. The right to speak is left, given or lent to him. I would need hours to justify any one of these 63 words. What interests me here, in the first place, is the nearly formal fatality of a performative effect. I shall have to limit myself to this formality, renouncing the detailed discussion of the content of the analyses. But before returning to this structural fatality, I would like to give an example, at least in parenthesis and only as an indication, of what this discussion could be. At the beginning of the monologue with Freud, basing himself on certain citations of the Midrash, Yerushalmi proposes a first conclusion to Professor Freud. If Moses had actually been killed by our forefathers, not only would the murder not have been repressed but on the contrary it would have been remembered and recorded, i.e., archived, eagerly and implacably, in the most vivid detail, the quintessential and ultimate exemplum of the sin of Israel's disobedience. 85 This, in my opinion, is the sinews of the argument in this book. Now to affirm this, Yerushalmi must again suppose that the contradiction between the act of memory or of archivization on the one hand and repression on the other remains irreducible. As if one could not, precisely, recall and archive the very thing one represses, archive it while repressing it, because repression is an archivization, that is to say, to archive otherwise, to repress the archive while archiving the repression, otherwise, of course, and that is the whole problem, then according to the current, conscious, patent modes of archivization, otherwise, that is to say, according to the paths which have called to psychoanalytic deciphering, in truth to psychoanalysis itself. How can Yerushalmi be sure that the murder in question has not been abundantly recalled and archived, remembered and recorded, in the memory of Israel? How can he claim to prove an absence of archive? How does one prove in general an absence of archive, if not in relying on classical norms, present/absence of literal and explicit reference to this or to that, to this or to that which one supposes to be identical to themselves, and simply absent, actually absent, if they are not simply present, actually present, how can one not, and why not, take into account unconscious, and more generally virtual archives? Now Yerushalmi knows very well that Freud's intention is to analyze, across the apparent absence of memory and of archive, all kinds of symptoms, signs, figures, metaphors, and metonymies that attest, at least virtually, an archival documentation where the ordinary historian identifies none. Whether one goes along with him or not in his demonstration, Freud claimed that the murder of Moses effectively left archives, documents, symptoms in the Jewish memory and even in the memory of humanity. Only the texts of this archive are not readable according to the paths of ordinary history, and this is the very relevance of psychoanalysis, if it has one. Let us go further, keeping close to the example chosen by Yerushalmi, who has the courage and the merit, the temerity even, to cite not only the Bible but rabbis in the Midrash who are still more explicit than the Bible in testifying at least about an attempted murder, and the entire community threatened to stone them with stones, Numbers 14:10. And who were they? Moses and Aaron. But the verse continues, when the glory of the Lord appeared in the tent of meeting unto all the children of Israel. This teaches us that they, the Israelites, were throwing stones and the cloud of the Lord's glory would intercept them. 85 Yerushalmi seems to conclude and to want to convince Professor Freud that if in fact they wanted to kill Moses and Aaron, and if this intention has indeed remained in the memory and in the archive, what counts is that the Israelites did not actually kill him. This conclusion appears to be doubly fragile. And even from the Midrash point of view in question. First, without needing to convoke psychoanalysis yet, one should recognize that if the murder did not take place, if it remained virtual, if it only almost took place, the intention to kill was effective, actual, and in truth accomplished. There was acting out, the stones were thrown, in fact, they continued to be thrown while only divine intervention intercepted them. The crime was not interrupted at any moment by Israelites themselves, going no further than their suspended intention, or renouncing in the face of the sin. There was thus not only intention I-65 but attempt to murder, adjective, actual attempt, which only an exterior cause, a jurist would say an accident, diverted. Second, and this time taking into account a psychoanalytic logic, what difference is there between a murder and an intention to murder, above all if it is acted out, but even if it is not murder, even if the intention does not become attempt to murder? Murder begins with the intention to kill. The unconscious does not know the difference here between the virtual and the accuttl, the intention and the action, a certain Judaism also, by the way, or at least does not model itself on the manner in which the conscious, as well as the law or the morals accorded to it, distributes the relations of the virtual, of the intentional, and of the actual. We will never have finished, we have not in truth begun, drawing all the ethico-juridical consequences from this. In any case, the unconscious may have kept the memory and the archive of the intention to kill, of the acting out of this desire to kill, as it is attested by the texts Yerushalmi himself cites, in particular the singular Midrash, even if there has been repression, because a repression also archives that of which it dissimulates or encrypts the archives. What is more, we see well that the repression was not all that efficient, the will to kill, the acting out and the attempt to murder are avowed, they are literally inscribed in the archive. If Moses was not killed, it is only thanks to God. Left to themselves, the Israelites, who wanted to kill Moses, would have killed him, they did everything to kill him. Earlier, Yerushalmi declared, the vital question remains whether, if Moses had been murdered in the wilderness, this would have been forgotten or concealed. 84. And everything in his text responds no. Now instead of signifying, as he believes he can claim, that if the murder did not leave any archives it is because it did not take place, it suffices to read the texts he himself cites to conclude the contrary, the intention to kill was effective, the acting out also, this left an archive, and even if there had not been acting out of the desire, the unconscious would have been able to keep the archive of the pure criminal intention, of its suspension or of its repression. We can say this, it would seem, without having to take sides, which I am not doing, but on the logical reading of the whole of this argumentation alone. And to extend the problematic field of an archive of the virtual, in its greatest generality, throughout and beyond psychoanalysis. The topology and the nomology we have analyzed up to now were able to necessitate, as an absolutely indispensable condition, the full and effective actuality of the taking place, the reality, as they say, of the archived event. What will become of this when we will indeed have to remove the concept of virtuality from the couple that opposes it to actuality, to effectivity, or to reality? Will we be obliged to continue thinking that there is no thinkable archive for the virtual? For what happens in virtual space and time? It is hardly probable, this mutation is in progress, but it will be necessary, to keep a rigorous account of this other virtuality, to abandon or restructure from top to bottom our inherited concept of the archive. The moment has come to accept a great stirring in our conceptual archive, and in it to cross a logic of the unconscious with a way of thinking of the virtual which is no longer limited by the traditional philosophical opposition between act and power. Let us return now to what we called a moment ago the fatal and formal constraint of a performative effect. This effect is due to what the signatory of the monologue does, in the scene he thinks he can organize, while playing, or assuming a certain role in it. This effect seems to show the phantom to be right, in the very place where he could, perhaps, be wrong and lose in the conflict of arguments. Because the scene effectively repeats, and it could not be more obvious, everything Freud says both about the return of phantoms and, to use the words of Yerushalmi, about the tense agon of father and son 95. One could show this in detail. Such a repetition attests that historical truth which no breach of material truth will ever weaken. What confirms or demonstrates a certain truth of Freud's Moses is not Freud's book, or the arguments deployed there with more or less pertinence. It is not the contents of this historical novel, it is rather the scene of reading it provokes and in which the reader is inscribed in advance. For example, in a fictive monologue which, in reading, contesting, or in calling to Freud, repeats in an exemplary fashion the logic of the event whose spectre was described and whose structure was performed by the historical novel. The Freud of this Freud's Moses is indeed Yerushalmi's Moses. The strange result of this performative Repi 67 the irrepressible effectuation of this enactment, in any case what it unavoidably demonstrates, is that the interpretation of the archive, here, for example, Yerushalmi's book, can only illuminate, read, interpret, establish its object, namely a given inheritance, by inscribing itself into it, that is to say by opening it and by enriching it enough to have a rightful place in it. There is no meta-archive. Yerushalmi's book, including its fictive monologue, henceforth belongs to the corpus of Freud, and of Moses, etc., whose name it also carries. The fact that this corpus and this name also remain spectral is perhaps a general structure of every archive. By incorporating the knowledge deployed in reference to it, the archive augments itself, engrosses itself, it gains in auctoritas. But in the same stroke it loses the absolute and metatextual authority it might claim to have. One will never be able to objectivize it with no remainder. The archivist produces more archive, and that is why the archive is never closed. It opens out of the future. How can we think about this fatal repetition, about repetition in general in its relationship to memory and the archive? It is easy to perceive, if not to interpret, the necessity of such a relationship, at least if one associates the archive, as naturally one is always tempted to do, with repetition, and repetition with the past. But it is the future that is at issue here, and the archive as an irreducible experience of the future. And if there is a single trait about which Yerushalmi remains intractable, if there is an affirmation shielded from all discussion, psychoanalytic or Talmudic, an unconditional affirmation, it is the affirmation of the future to come l'avenir, in French. I prefer saying this with the to come of the avenir rather than the futur so as to point toward the coming of an event rather than toward some future present. The affirmation of the future to come, this is not a positive thesis. It is nothing other than the affirmation itself, the yes, insofar as it is the condition of all promises or of all hope, of all awaiting, of all performativity, of all opening toward the future, whatever it may be, for science or for religion. I am prepared to subscribe without reserve to this reaffirmation made by Yerushalmi. With a speck of anxiety, in the back of my mind, a single speck of anxiety about a solitary point, which is not just any point. I will specify it with more precision in a moment. This unique point can be reduced, indeed, to the unique, to the unity of the one and of the unique. The same affirmation of the future to come is repeated several times. It comes back at least according to three modalities, which also establish three places of opening. Let us give them the name of doors. The three doors of the future to come resemble each other to the point of confusion, indeed, but they differ between themselves, at least in that they regularly turn on their hinges to open, one onto the other. Their topologic thus remains properly disorienting. One continually has the feeling of getting lost while retracing one's steps and revenant sur ses pas. What is a door doing when it opens onto a door? And above all onto a door one has already passed through, in the passage of what comes to pass, in the passage to come? In naming these doors, I think or rather I dream of Walter Benjamin. In his theses on the philosophy of history, he designates the narrow door for the passage of the Messiah, at each second. And he recalls also that for the Jews the future to come nonetheless does not become a homogeneous and empty time 12.702. What could he have meant? Or, at least for the time being, what can we understand in this remark or make it say, this remark about the door of a future to come whose time would not be homogeneous? Allow me thus to localize and identify what I call the three doors of the future to come, as I believe I can count them in the monologue with Freud. The last door opens, of course, at the last sentence of the book. A remarkable and necessary location, decisive precisely where nothing is decided. It is not by chance that this last door takes the form of a promise, the promise of a secret kept secret. What happens when a historian promises to keep secret on the subject of an archive which is yet to be established? Who does this? Is he still a historian? To whom does he promise? Before whom? Before what law? Before what spectre and before what witness does Yerushalmi pretend to commit himself for the future to keep Freud's response secret when he declares to him in the last words of the book, please tell me, Professor. I promise I won't reveal your answer to anyone. How could the person who promises a secret to a spectre still dare to say he is a historian? We would not believe him, even if he pretended to address the professor as a colleague or a master. The historian speaks only of the past. Yerushalmi says this himself at the end of the first of his texts that I read, a text about the Marranos, with whom I have always secretly identified, but don't tell anyone, and whose crypto-Judaic history greatly resembles that of psychoanalysis after all. Regarding the last Marranos, Yerushalmi writes, but are they really the last? History, as we have recently seen, is not always rational, it is rarely foreseeable. The future, in spite of the appearances, always remains open. The historian's task, luckily, is to try to understand the past. It is time for the historian to step aside to let the images speak. Brenner and Yerushalmi 44, my emphasis at the date of this text on the Marranos, and Yerushalmi always dates twice at the moment of signing or archiving his works, according to two calendars, the Jewish one and the other one. What is at issue for him is letting the images speak in a book of photographs, that is, another species of archive. But each time a historian as such decides to step aside and let speak, for example to let a photographic spectre or Freud's phantom in the monologue speak, it is the sign of a respect before the future to come of the future to come. Thus he is no longer a historian. Good sense tells us there is no history or archive of the future to come. A historian as such never looks to the future, which in the end does not concern him. But meaning something else altogether, is there a historian of the promise, a historian of the first door? The second door leaves a double definition open to the future, both that of Jewishness and that of science. Definition open to a future radically to come, which is to say indeterminate, determined only by this opening of the future to come. Intermination forcefully and doubly potentialized, intermination en avim. In effect, on the one hand, it intermines one intermination by the other, Jewishness by science and science by Jewishness. I cite this essential passage a second time, Professor Freud. At this point I find it futile to ask whether, genetically or structurally, psychoanalysis is really a Jewish science, that we shall know, if it is at all knowable my emphasis, only when much future work has been done. Much will depend, of course, on how the very terms Jewish and science are to be defined. This remark followed an allusion to much future work and it opened to infinity the gaping of the future in which the very possibility of knowledge remained conditional, if it is at all knowable. In other words, the definition of the two terms depends on the future. In this equation with two unknowns, only the future of science, in particular that of psychoanalysis, will say whether the science is Jewish, because it will tell us what science is and what Jewishness is. But only the future of Judaism, or rather of interminable Jewishness, will be able to guide and precede a science of Judaism, or rather of Jewishness, indeed a Jewish science. Now since the future of science can thus be correlative to Jewishness, there is every risk, or every chance, that in this logical aporia, the question is destined to remain without response in any case in the form of theoretical knowledge or of episteme. Hence, on the other hand, a second force of intermination. It is readable in the several suspensive words that leave a possibility open, that this double question which binds Jewishness and science does not come within the province of knowledge and is heterogeneous to all theoretical statement, that we shall know, if it is at all knowable. Having arrived at these last lines of the book, we still cannot say anything pertinent about what binds science and Jewishness, about what stabilizes and guarantees these concepts, and thus those of the archives which are dependent on them. Nothing that seems scientifically relevant. I will say in passing that this is what neutralizes or perhaps invalidates all that Yerushalmi had wanted to demonstrate up to this point. This is what threatens it, at least in its theoretic value if not in its dramatic effect or its performative richness. I-71 But there is something more serious and perhaps better. In the future, it is very possible that the solution to this equation with two unknowns will not come within the domain of theoretical knowledge, that is to say, of a declarative theorem. This is what is suggested by if it is at all knowable. This epical suspense gathers in an act all the energy of thought, an energy of virtuality, for once, energy of a dynamis. The intensity of this suspension is vertiginous and it gives vertigo while GLBMG the only condition on which the future to come remains what it is to come. The condition on which the future remains to come is not only that it not be known, but that it not be knowable as such. Its determination should no longer come under the order of knowledge or of a horizon of pre-knowledge but rather a coming or an event which one allows or incites to come, without seeing anything come, in an experience which is heterogeneous to all taking note, as to any horizon of waiting as such, that is to say, to all stabilizable theorems as such. It is a question of this performative to come whose archive no longer has any relation to the record of what is, to the record of the presence of what is or will have been actually present. I call this the messianic, and I distinguish it radically from all messianism. The third door is also the first, and we have already passed through it. A few pages earlier, Yerushalmi had deployed the question of the future or the immortality of Oedipus. And what he had held in opposition to Freud, finally, is an experience of the future or of hopefulness which seems to him to be at once irreducible to Oedipal repetition and irreducibly, uniquely, exclusively Jewish, proper to Jewishness if not to Judaism. The subtitle of his book says Judaism terminable and interminable. But Yerushalmi clearly marks that if Judaism is terminable, Jewishness is interminable 90. It can survive Judaism. It can survive it as a heritage, which is to say, in a sense, not without archive, even if this archive should remain without substrate and without actuality. For Yerushalmi, there is indeed a determining and irreducible essence of Jewishness, it is already given and does not await the future. And this essence of Jewishness should not be mistaken as merging with Judaism, or with religion, or even with the belief in God. Now the Jewishness that does not await the future is precisely the waiting for the future, the opening of a relation to the future, the experience of the future. This is what would be proper to the Jew and to him alone, not only hope, not only a hope for the future, but the anticipation of a specific hope for the future 95. And this is where, in the name of the opening to the future, the discussion with Freud seems to be closed, even while in the last lines of the book it is the word Jewish, which can be the adjective for Jewishness as well as for Judaism, that Yerushalmi says remains to be defined in the future. Here is one of the passages that are most important to us on this subject. I shall emphasize certain phrases. Indeed, the charm of it all is that Oedipus is far from alien to the Bible itself, where the entire relationship between God and man and especially between God and Israel is always the tense agon of father and son. The dramatic difference lies not in the perception of past and present, but in the anticipation of a specific hope for the future. There is a remarkable verse in the last of the prophets, Malachi 3:24. This is my emphasis, and here is one of the archives which attest to that anticipation of a specific hope for the future. An archive, according to the archivist, which would be unique. The word is very serious, which expresses a unique vision. My emphasis that is not to be found, at least not explicitly. I also emphasize this concession which opens onto the abyss which it denies in the messianic prophecies of any of his predecessors. All the others, we might say, posit an ultimate resolution of the Oedipal conflict between Israel and God. Malachi does so also on the level of the purely human. Ve heshid levavet al-banim ve banim al-avatam. He shall reconcile the heart of fathers with sons and the heart of sons with their fathers. 95 More confident than I would be about the meaning here in all rigor of unique, explicitly, and purely human, Yerushalmi continues, and this is the point of rupture, Eli Didik. Let it be according to you that religion, the great I-73 illusion, has no future. But what is the future of Leos and Oedipus? We read to the end of your Moses, and you do not say thus. Once again, Yerushalmi records the silence of Freud, who he will nonetheless make speak, virtually, not explicitly, in the conditional, in the very next sentence. But should you tell me that, indeed, they have no hope, I shall simply reply you may very well be right. But it is on this question of hope or hopelessness, even more than on God or godlessness, that your teaching may be at its most un-Jewish. 95. My emphasis what would be the least Jewish, the most un-Jewish, the most heterogeneous to Jewishness, would not be a lack of Judaism, a distancing, as the French translation says, with respect to Judaism, religion, belief in God, Israel's election, but the non-belief in the future, that is to say, in what constitutes Jewishness beyond all Judaism. Beyond the precautions and the conditions, we have here an affirmation which is excluded from all discussion to come, an unconditional affirmation, the link between Jewishness, if not Judaism, and hope in the future. This affirmation is unconditional, first of all, in its form, it is intractable and excludes itself, for what ties it to Jewishness, from all discussion. But it is again unconditional in its content, as should be every affirmation of this type. It is in effect nothing other than the affirmation of affirmation, the yes to the originary yes, the inaugural engagement of a promise or of an anticipation which wagers, a prior of the very future. The necessity of affirming affirmation, the affirmation of affirmation, must be at once tautological and heterological. Yerushalmi is ready to make concessions on everything, including on the existence of God and on the future of religion, on everything except on the trait that links Jewishness and the opening toward the future. And, still more radically, on the absolute uniqueness of this trait. The uniqueness of the trait is first of all the ineffaceable trait de-union between Jewishness and future avenir. The being Jewish and the being open toward the future would be the same thing, the same unique thing, the same thing as uniqueness, and they would not be dissociable the one from the other. To be open toward the future would be to be Jewish. And vice versa. And in exemplary fashion. It would be not only to have a future, to be capable of anticipation, etc., a shared aptitude whose universality could appear to be indisputable, but to be in relation to the future as such. And to hold one's identity, reflect it, declare it, announce it to oneself, only out of what comes from the future to come. Thus would be the trait, the exemplary uniqueness of the trait de-union. Without risking myself in the logical abyss of this affirmation and in the aporias of exemplarity, which I have tried to describe elsewhere, and indeed on the subject of Jewish exemplarity, I must once again content myself with pointing to the archive. Precisely where we see one door open or close upon another. Because in the last analysis, this unconditional affirmation, which presents itself, I said, as ineffaceable, bases its authority, in the first place, on the precedence of an archive, for example, as we just saw, a verse of the last of the prophets, as it is interpreted by the archivist. But the authority of the same unconditional affirmation is above all based on what could resemble another unique trait of Jewishness according to Yerushalmi, and which undoubtedly repeats the first as if it came down to the same thing. This time it has to do not only with opening toward the future, but with historicity and with the obligation of memory, or better, with the obligation of the archive. I am referring now to another of Yerushalmi's books, as fine and as rightly celebrated, Zachor, Jewish History and Jewish Memory. If, in the passage of Freud's Moses we were just reading, Yerushalmi named the drama of a dramatic difference on the subject of the future as something Jewish, here he speaks again of drama, of dramatic evidence, dramatic proof, mark, clue, dramatic testimony, in the broad sense of the word testimony, one could even say archive, on the subject of the past as something Jewish and uniquely, exclusively, only Jewish, no more dramatic evidence is needed for the dominant place of history in ancient Israel than the overriding fact that even God is known only insofar as he reveals himself historically. 9. And after several citations meant to support this affirmation in quotes, we find ourselves before this extraordinary attribution, the I-75 injunction of memory falls to Israel, and to Israel alone. Now a minute ago, already, we had the same attribution, the same assignation without any sharing. It was a question then of the anticipation of a specific hope for the future. 2 exclusivities, indeed 2 exclusions. 2 solitudes and 2 responsibilities, 2 assignations in the absolute privilege of election. As if Yerushalmi were ready to renounce everything in Judaism, terminable, that was not Jewishness, interminable, everything, the belief in the existence of God, the religion, the culture, etc., except that archive trait of Jewishness which is something that at least resembles election even if it is not to be confused with it, the absolute privilege, the absolute uniqueness in the experience of the promise, the future, and the injunction of memory, the past. But the two are not added or juxtaposed, the one is founded on the other. It is because there has been an archived event, because the injunction or the law has already presented and inscribed itself into historical memory as an injunction of memory, with or without substrate, that the two absolute privileges are bound the one to the other. As if God had inscribed only one thing into the memory of one single people and of an entire people, in the future, remember to remember the future. And as if the word people, in this sentence, could only be conceived of out of the unprecedented uniqueness of this archive injunction. Here is what I call the extraordinary attribution, on the subject of which I will keep a large number of grave questions in reserve. Some of them would have an ethical or political dimension, but they are not the only ones, in spite of their obvious urgency. I would have liked to spend hours, in truth and eternity, meditating while trembling before this sentence, only in Israel and nowhere else is the injunction to remember felt as a religious imperative to an entire people. 9. How can one not tremble before this sentence? I wonder if it is just. Who could ever be assured, by what archive, that it is just, this sentence? Just with the justice that Yerushalmi suggests so profoundly elsewhere could indeed be the opposite of forgetting. I feel myself to be very close to what he says then in this direction, and incidentally, in the form of a question. Point 14 at the end of the postscript of Zachor, the same question in effect Riso 14. I have, for my part, notably enforced the law and specters of Marx, tried to situate justice, the justice which exceeds but also requires the law, in the direction of the act of memory, of resistance to forgetting, whether this be of the injunction in general or of its place of assignation, other people, living or dead. Nates. Is it possible that the antonym of forgetting is not remembering, but justice? 117. Thinking about this justice, I wonder, trembling, if they are just, the sentences which reserve for Israel both the future and the past as such, both hope, the anticipation of a specific hope for the future, and the duty of memory, the injunction to remember, assignation which would be felt by Israel alone, Israel as a people and Israel in its totality, only in Israel and nowhere else as a religious imperative to an entire people. Unless, in the logic of this election, one were to call by the unique name of Israel all the places and all the peoples who would be ready to recognize themselves in this anticipation and in this injunction, and then this would no longer only be a vertiginous problem of semantics or of rhetoric. Like the question of the proper name, the question of exemplarity, which I put aside earlier, here situates the place of all violences. Because if it is just to remember the future and the injunction to remember, namely the archontic injunction to guard and to gather the archive, it is no less just to remember the others, the other others and the others in oneself, and that the other peoples could say the same thing in another way. And that tout autre est tout autre, as we can say in French, every other is every other, is altogether other. Formalizing too quickly so as to gain time, let us go straight to the reason for which one can be dumbfounded with dread before the virtual injustice one risks committing in the name of justice itself. Let us formulate the argument really in a mode which in a certain sense crosses psychoanalysis with deconstruction, a certain psychoanalysis and a certain deconstruction. When I say that I tremble, I mean that one trembles, the one or the trembles, whoever it is trembles, because the injustice of this justice can concentrate its violence in the very constitution of the one and of the I-77 unique. Right where it can affect everyone, and anyone, whoever. In the sentences I just cited, the words that make me tremble are only those that say the one, the difference of the one in the form of uniqueness, dramatic difference, unique vision, specific hope, only in Israel and nowhere else, and the one in the figure of totalizing assemblage, to an entire people. The gathering into itself of the one is never without violence, nor is the self-affirmation of the unique, the law of the archontic, the law of consignation which orders the archive. Consignation is never without that excessive pressure, impression, repression, suppression, of which repression, verdrängen or verdrängen, and suppression, unterdrücken, are at least figures. For it may not be necessary to give psychoanalytic names to this violence. Neither necessary nor assured. Nor primordial. Is it not sufficient to recognize this violence at work in the archontic constitution of the one and of the unique for Freud to find an automatic or structural justification for his historical novel? Does the necessity of this archontic violence not give meaning to his Moses, and even an undeniable truth, a historical truth if not a material truth? To his Moses, to Jacob his father, in short to Freud, whose Moses was also the Moses of Yerushalmi. To the son as grandfather, to whomever, to anyone, to someone who says I, to myself, for example, Jacob or Eli, I who have not only a father named Ham, but also, as if by chance, a grandfather named Moses. And another, Abraham. As soon as there is the one, there is murder, wounding, traumatism. El on se garde el autre. The one guards against / keeps some of the other. It protects itself from the other, but, in the movement of this jealous violence, it comprises in itself, thus guarding it, the self-otherness or self-difference, the difference from within oneself, which makes it one. The one differing from itself. The one as the other. At once, at the same time, but in a same time that is out of joint, the one forgets to remember itself to itself, it keeps and erases the archive of this injustice that it is. Of this violence that it does. El on se fate violence. The one makes itself violence. It violates and does violence to itself, but it also institutes itself as violence. It becomes what it is, the very violence that it does to itself. Self-determination as violence. El on se garde l'autre pour se faire violence, because it makes itself violence and so as to make itself violence. Only in French can this be said and thus archived in such an economical fashion. 1515. At the end of this lecture, not without irony, I imagine, with as much depth as astonishment but, as always, with an intractable lucidity, Geoffrey, now it is necessary that this repeat itself. It is necessity itself, an ankh. The one, as self-repetition, can only repeat and recall this instituting violence. It can only affirm itself and engage itself in this repetition. This is even what ties in depth the injunction of memory with the anticipation of the future to come. The injunction, even when it summons memory or the safeguard of the archive, turns incontestably toward the future to come. It orders to promise, but it orders repetition, and first of all self-repetition, self-confirmation in a yes, yes. If repetition is thus inscribed at the heart of the future to come, one must also import there, in the same stroke, the death drive, the violence of forgetting, super-repression, suppression and repression, the anarchive, in short, the possibility of putting to death the very thing, whatever its name, which carries the law in its tradition, the archon of the archive, the table, what carries the table and who carries the table, the subjectal, the substrate, and the subject of the law. This is why Freud might not have accepted in this form the alternative between the future and the past of Oedipus, or between hope and hopelessness, the Jew and the non-Jew, the future and repetition. The one, alas, or happily, is the condition of the other. And the other is the condition for the one. To be able to say that the decisive and for the moment undecidable question is, Bennington remarked to me that by underlining, and first by bringing into play, such an untranslatability, I risk repeating the gesture I seem to put into question in the hands of the other, namely, the affirmation of the unique or of the idiom. To clarify here the response I gave him then, I will briefly say three things. I did not talk of absolute untranslatability or idiomaticity, but of a greater economy. It was a question of my saying in very few French words, in this case, in this occurrence, what can by all means be translated in any language, if only I-79 one uses more, which suffices to change the political sense of this gesture. 2. I believe that the affirmation of a certain idiomaticity, of a certain uniqueness, as of a certain differing, that is to say, impure, unity is irreducible and necessary, and I wanted thus to demonstrate it practically. What one does next, both with this affirmation, and with this impurity, is precisely where all of politics comes in. 3. Let us say at last that I wanted to exercise, in another political gesture, my own right to irony and, exposing myself to it thus in my language, to give an example of this fatal necessity and of its risks. 80. I knowing, if at least it is a matter of knowledge, if it is at all knowable, what the words Jewish and science mean, and that this remains open toward the future, one must give oneself at least a pre-understanding of what to come means. Now it is in the structure of the future to come that it can only posit itself while welcoming repetition, as much in the respect for faithfulness to others and to oneself as in the violent repositioning of the one. The answer to the question, what is the future, seems thus to be presupposed by Yerushalmi. It is prior to the affirmation according to which the future will say how to define science and Jewish science. With respect to this presupposition or this pre-understanding, we find ourselves here before an aporia. I have attempted to struggle with this elsewhere, and I shall say only a word about it. From the point of view of the archive, does one base one's thinking of the future on an archived event with or without substrate, with or without actuality, for example on a divine injunction or on a messianic covenant? Or else, on the contrary, can an experience, an existence, in general, only receive and record, only archive such an event to the extent that the structure of this existence and of its temporalization makes this archivization possible? In other words, does one need a first archive in order to conceive of originary archivability? Or vice versa? This is the whole question of the relation between the event of the religious revelation, a fenherum, and a revealability, often harket, a possibility of manifestation, the prior thought of what opens toward the arrival or toward the coming of such an event. Is it not true that the logic of the after fact, nachtriegelijkheid, which is not only at the heart of psychoanalysis, but even, literally, the sinews of all deferred, nachtriegelijk, obedience, turns out to disrupt, disturb, entangle forever the reassuring distinction between the two terms of this alternative, as between the past and the future, that is to say, between the three actual presents, which would be the past present, the present present, and the future present? In any case, there would be no future without repetition. And thus, as Freud might say, this would be his thesis, there is no future without the specter of the Oedipal violence that inscribes the super-repression into the archontic institution of the archive, in the position, the auto-position or the heteroposition of the one and of the unique, in the nomological arc. And the death drive. Without this evil, which is also archive fever, the desire and the disorder of the archive, there would be neither assignation nor consignation. For assignation is a consignation. And when one says nomological arc, one says nomos, one says the law, but also thesis or them is. The law of institution, nomos, thesis, or themis, is the thesis. Thesis and themis are sometimes, not always, in tension with the originary physis, with what one translates commonly as nature. It is thus that, with the thesis, the supplement of theses that were to follow the exerg, preamble, and foreword has insinuated itself already and in advance. That is, not to resist the desire of a postscript, a prosthesis on Freud's theses. 16 which is advanced at the pace of other ghosts. 16 Freud does not hesitate to speak of a prosthesis of repression. Certain adjuvant and substitutive technologies prove that the fulfillment of repression in its regular form comes up against difficulties. But this sign of failure also permits to better illuminate, right on the prosthesis, the end and the technique of repression. All of this concerns the event itself, the coming of what arrives or not. There is nothing fortuitous in that one of these prostheses serves the ungeschehen, the making it not have happened, even though it has happened. It is thus to treat an event as not happened, in French in the text, non-arrive, see inhibitions, symptoms, and anxiety, 20, 77.